Hello, sorry it's taken so long to get the third reading of Abandon My Eulogy out. A lot of personal stuff has been happening, like weddings, things like that. Um, Also, when I was recording it, I just I couldn't record it in a way I liked. It didn't sound right to me, so that's also why it's been taking a while as well. Anyways, tell me if you'd like me to add tell me if you'd like me to add sound effects in future readings, because I've been thinking about doing that, but they will take longer if that happens. Uh Anyways, thank you and let's get into it. Abandon My Eulogy is by Miss E on AO3, also known as aroace-get-out-of-my-face on Tumblr. The reading is done by me, Glacier Roller, and I really hope you enjoy. Chapter 3. Ford, don't stick your hand in a dead guy's pockets. You don't know where he's been. As a broad generalization, Stanford doesn't keep fictional books in his house. Sure, he likes them, but over years of research and weirdness, one's shelves tend to fill up. Besides, all the storybooks and novels Ford might have owned actually belonged to Stanley. Taking those books with him when he went to college was out of the question. And when Ford moved up to Oregon, he'd left them behind in that room above the pawnshop. Stanford's shelf space is reserved for physics and geometry, cryptozoology, and accounts of supernatural occurrences, all books he might need to take reference from during his studies. Resurrection, R, 18th letter of the English alphabet, organized on his shelves. It's on the fourth bookcase, third row down. Ford has plenty of books on the subject. Up until he dropped everything to work on the portal, Ford was investigating the supernatural and undead of Gravity Falls, documenting them all in his third journal. He itches for the ability to flip through his own writing, but keeping more than one journal anywhere near each other was a bad idea. Ford winces at the shiver that runs down his spine. The problem in Ford's research, however, is simple. He's documented ghosts and ghouls, hauntings and spirits, zombies and undead creatures of untold variety. But Stanford wants his brother back, not some mindless creature. He braces his hand on the bookshelf and forces his brain to work. The novel Frankenstein drifts to the front of his mind. They'd read it together, back in high school, when Stan and Ford were still Stan and Ford. One particular exam question on the book lingers in Ford's mind, even now. In your own words, describe the mistakes Victor Frankenstein made in Chapter 5. It's the chapter in which the doctor brings life to the creature, and Stanford had written paragraphs as his answer. He'd torn apart Frankenstein's scientific method, the inaccuracies that would have rendered his experiment a failure. Later, when they'd gotten their tests back, Stanford was surprised to find that he and Stanley had gotten the same grade for that question, despite the latter's answer only being a sentence long. When he'd asked, Stan had laughed and thrown an arm around his shoulders. "It was a trick question, Sixer," he shrugged. "You shouldn't have made a monster at all." Ford steps backwards to the second bookshelf along the wall. Frankenstein, F, sixth letter in the English alphabet, 2 rows down. Most of his books were for scientific purposes only, purely practical reasons, but Ford allowed himself some sentiment, and when he'd returned home for the holidays a few years ago, he'd come back with a parting memory from his old bedroom. The copy is worn, its pages ruffled and dog-eared from age and the changing of hands. Ford runs his fingers over the faded cover. He isn't sure whose it originally belonged to between the two of them. A little later, once Ford has mused through his bare-bones plan, he appreciates all of the steps to Victor Frankenstein's creation that Mary Shelley glossed over. But Frankenstein was trying to create life, slot life into a place where it never was originally. Ford's methods are a lot more straightforward. You see, Stanley, he says, maneuvering his brother's corpse into a more manageable position, we have to ensure that you'll have a body to come back to. Decay is an enemy, an equation to write out and solve, a problem to disassemble, The first step to any equation is to simplify. Stanley is considerably lighter than the last time Ford had to lug him around as children, but that doesn't mean it's an easy feat. Ford has half dragged, half carried his brother out of the armchair, across multiple rooms, through countless doorways. Really, why did Ford add so many doorways to his own house? He was sure he didn't need that many, and to the top of the basement stairs. Now he is slightly out of breath. There are spots dancing over his eyes, or maybe tears. Ford isn't entirely sure which side of the hysteria line he is standing on. We can simplify the problem into three main parts. Three steps, like any equation, Ford says once he's caught his breath again. He starts the careful, painstaking task of dragging his brother down the stairs. Isolate the unknown variable and perform operations on the rest. Ford's quite happy with his metaphor, and there's a certain nostalgia to explaining something to Stanley again. Back when they'd still taken math classes together, Ford was constantly tasked with helping Stan understand, talking through a problem until Stan figured it out or gave up. Ford had grown to despise that job, and as years went by, he'd started purposely explaining concepts in a way he'd known Stanley wouldn't understand, all in a twisted effort to get Stan to do it himself. Sink or swim was a phrase their father used often, and it was so ingrained into their childhood that when Stanley's grades started to slip, all Ford felt was the sick sense of vindication. He swallows back the bile now, stumbling over the weight of his guilt as he braces against the handrail. Some brother he'd turn out to be. I'm not sure exactly how to restart your bodily functions yet, Ford says when he can speak again around the stone in his throat, but I do know how to heal you, and that's a start. Three steps to this problem. Three simple, easy steps. Stop the rot, heal the vessel, restart the system. Simple. Ford sniffs and blinks back the pinpricks at the edge of his eyes. He has a plan. As he supports Stanley's body down the steps, he thinks it over again. Stopping the rot is the most difficult and most important. Stanley would need to be preserved, suspended in such a way that gave Ford time, a day or two to gather and prepare the magical components necessary to heal what was already lost or broken, like brain matter. Stanford knows. He knows that the human brain cells begin to die in a matter of minutes after death. He knows it, and yet he let himself sit and cry for hours, not doing anything at all, feeling sorry for himself, and it may already be too. He takes a deep breath and focuses on the problem. There are magical elements and resources all over Gravity Falls. Many of them Ford has yet to fully identify and document, but he does know of a restorative mushroom, one that grows on the border of a crystal glade half a day's hike from the cabin. When mixed with a strong adhesive and water gathered under a new moon, the mixture provided extraordinary restorative powers. Even in preliminary tests with gnome subjects, Ford was able to regrow a tooth in the correct positioning in only a matter of minutes. Such things were not possible in the realm of known science, but then again, neither was true resurrection. Ford backs into and shuffles through the door, leading to the portal's control room. He hates coming down here at all, but this space is the best place for what he needs. Here, dozens of feet underground, everything was silent, cool, and still. Best of all, the entire level is temperature controlled. In an effort to reduce variability during the portal's test phase, the entire underground lab was sealed to be completely airtight. Ventilation runs up through the dirt directly outside, and every corner down here has a large air conditioning unit for the summer months. There's no heater, however, which means that in the dead of winter, the control room is utterly freezing. Exactly what Ford needs. In the center of the chamber, just off to the side of the portal's control panel, is a metal table. Stanford levers Stan's body onto it, carefully hoisting his stiff and unmoving limbs up and onto the table's surface. Here in this environment, Stanford is sure the body will keep. Ford can see his own breath, but he scampers to the wall where the air conditioning controls are and cranks it to as low of a temperature it will go. The overhead fans kick in, and Stanford can feel the temperature drop even more in this enclosed space. It'll be a terrible environment to work in, he supposes, but he's planning to have his brother alive and out of this basement within the week. Or maybe next week? Ford isn't quite sure what day it is. Stanford retrieves an old plaid blanket from the chair at the control panel and unfolds it as he steps up to the table. He'll have to leave Stan down here as he makes more preparations, but leaving him just lying there on a table feels wrong. It feels like leaving him in a tomb. Stanford shivers, and it's not entirely from the cold. He drags a procedure cart over to the table. It once held various tools for construction, but Ford is repurposing it for a more important use. On the top shelf level are a few simple items: a pair of sharp scissors, assorted scalpels, a sewing kit Ford found in a junk drawer, and various sizes of tweezers. There are also a pair of six-fingered gloves. Ford reaches for them. It's imperative for a number of reasons that Stanford follows through with the rest of his steps as quickly as possible, but he cannot stop himself from hesitating. He has to remove it. The arrow. It remains where it was fired, jutting out of Stan's throat, and Ford cannot make himself touch it. He stands there in the freezing lab and stares at it, unblinking. His eyes dart around it, as if looking at Stan's face, collarbone, or unkempt hair will make the bolt go away, as if not looking at it will make the fired arrow no longer match the ones Ford has stashed in the entryway, as if he can make himself forget that he dealt the killing blow. He starts to thread his fingers into the gloves and stops, tries to steady his hands, watches them shake for a moment. Ford takes a deep breath and lets it linger in his chest for a moment as he reaches over Stan's body and pulls the fur of Stan's coat out of the way. It's clumped up with snow and blood, and as Ford takes the time to separate it, he realizes he's stalling. Stan's coat is sort of in the way, and Ford knows his hands won't stop shaking any time soon. Stanford sighs heavily and takes the gloves off, relieved despite himself. The jacket is harder to remove than he anticipated. Stan's arms are completely stiff, frozen there by the decay of his body's muscles, slightly bent at the elbow. Ford starts by trying to ease the coat down the shoulders, but the jacket is damp with melted snow, and while the coat is too big rather than too small, it's still impossible without putting too much strain on Stan's arms. Ford settles with inching it carefully off each arm one at a time, taking it in stages, rotating and tugging at the fabric as he goes. He refuses to outright cut the jacket, even if it's old and worn, terribly stained and too thin to offer much protection. The jacket is Stanley's, and Ford won't ruin it if he can save it, even if he thinks he'll never be able to stand the sight of it again. The white shirt underneath the coat may be unsalvageable. It looks to have been stained beforehand, and the blood that soaks the front of it has frozen and dried, stuck to the skin of Stan's torso. Ford gently pulls the very end of the coat sleeve off Stanley's arms and feels his stomach turn at the sight of it catching on Stan's frozen, discolored, and slightly curled fingers. The entire process was painstaking and disturbing, and Ford tries not to compare it in his mind to dressing a store mannequin. He drops the jacket to the floor, eager for the feeling of its wet and freezing fabric to be forgotten. When he does, the distinct sound of something metallic hitting the ground rings out through the lab, and Ford pauses. He fights the curiosity for a moment, then picks the jacket back up. It's weighted. Ford notices now that he's paying attention, and something heavy is in each pocket. On each side is one hand of a set of brass knuckles. Ford blinks at them. They're scuffed and old, gouged on the outer surface like they've been used. A lot. They're heavy, too, and Ford tests their weight in his hand before he sets them carefully on the second shelf of his procedure cart. He plans to return them, obviously, but he doubts they'll go through the wash well with the jacket. There is also a set of keys in the pockets, a simple ring of them, and Ford recognizes these in a heartbeat. They are to the El Diablo that's parked out front, the Stanmobile. Ford feels his face soften at the sight of them. He notices one more thing as he goes to put the jacket down again. a hand-sewn, zippered pocket situated just behind the zipper of the coat, a hidden pocket made to disappear. Ford debates with himself for less time than he'd admit before he carefully unzips it. If he expected some grand secret or a giant diamond, would be disappointed. Inside is a small, damp, folded piece of paper. It's a crumpled, pitiful thing. The creases are well worn, like it's been folded and unfolded again and again, and the edges are worn down like the paper has been in this pocket a long time. There are two things written on the paper, and Ford's brows furrow when he realizes he recognizes them both. They're numbers. Phone numbers. Just two of them, but the top one has been scratched out with a different color pen. The second visible number is one Ford knows could list off the top of his head any day. It's the number for his phone, the one right upstairs sitting on the kitchen counter. His landline, written in Stanley's handwriting. Ford recognizes the way Stan loops his twos, his fours, and slants his sevens. Ford squints and brings the paper closer to his face. He turns his head slightly and can make out the first number too. With a jolt, Ford realizes he knows that number also. That was his phone number back in college, in his dorm in Backups-More. The phone traveled with him between dorm rooms, even dorm buildings, but he'd gotten a new number when he relocated to Gravity Falls. Ford blinks at this tiny, confusing paper in his hands. Why would Stanley have this? Ford turns to look at the body on the table. Stanley had never once ever called Ford since he'd been kicked out. Never. Ford knows that it's truth all the way down to the bones and muscles and sinew of his last extra finger. He knows that Stanley was still in contact, at least occasionally, with their mother, that he would call and wish her a happy birthday or happy Hanukkah and ask her how things were down in the glass-shored beach. Ford knew that because he also called his mother, and she would poke and prod and pester as to why her twin boys hadn't made up yet. Ford had never received a call from Stanley, ever. In the beginning, in the weeks following the science fair, Ford answered every call that came into the house, no matter the hour. Maybe it was the guilt of it, or the desire to hear Stan grovel and apologize, admitting to his mistakes, or maybe the thought of their father being the one to answer Stan's pleading call home made Ford so ill that he would strain his ears for the first ring of the telephone. Whatever the reason, Ford knew that he'd never, ever picked up the phone and heard Stan's voice on the other end. So, why would Stanley have the phone numbers? Ford breathes out, slowly and carefully folds the delicate paper back up along its creases. He sets it down carefully next to the brass knuckles on the cart. He wants answers. The brass knuckles, the phone numbers, the dusty old jacket, they are all pieces to the story Ford has yet to uncover completely. He wants to, desperately, to understand in totality every rhyme or reason behind any of Stan's choices. He looks down and pushes his thumb along the side of one of Stan's car keys. It would be an invasion of privacy. Stanford doesn't need to know exactly what Stanley has been up to in the years they've been apart. He doesn't. He wants to know. He's concerned. But he has no real justification for going and snooping in his brother's car. He stands there in the quiet of his own basement, standing before the altar he's made of his brother's corpse, and debates with himself. Just a quick look. Technically it's snooping, looking through Stanley's car while he's, indisposed. But Stanford is an older brother, if only by 15 minutes, and the car is on his property, so... Before he goes to leave, though, Ford makes sure to double-check the thermostat, that it's the lowest it'll go. Then, in an act of sentiment, he throws the plaid blanket over Stanley. He almost pulls it over his face, like a shroud, but it seems too final, too much like a goodbye. Ford tucks the blanket in around Stan's chest, takes one more look at Stanley's slack face, and walks back up the stairs, into the house. The cabin is completely silent when Ford gets up there. The wind outside is muffled by wood and the snowy exterior. He takes a step, and the floorboards creak under his weight. He squeezes the car keys in his hand hard enough that the teeth of each key digs into his palm with a string. Ford unlocks the front door again, slowly this time, and peers through the peephole and out the front-facing windows before he opens the door. The crossbow sits on the porch where he left it, and despite the dangers looming in the outside world, Ford isn't sure if he could ever fire it again. Snow has drifted into the muddled ground where Stanley fell. It's the first place Stanford looks. Down the 3 steps of the porch. Any blood has been covered, and Stanley didn't struggle. The deepest grooves in the snow are from where Stanford kneeled, and then struggled to carry them both inside. There are more footsteps, Stanley's, that lead up to the cabin from the driveway. They dot the path, a solid line of disturbed snow, all the way back to Stanley's car. The Stanmobile. Ford's heart twists in his chest. It's the first time he's really looked at that car since high school. He remembers the first time Stanley drove it home, beaming and shouting for Ford to come look at his custom plates, its burgundy sides glistening with a fresh shine. Ford had never seen Stanley so happy for something all his own. The car sits in the snow, old and tired. Its paint is dirty and faded, mud and snow kicked up into its wheel wells. Ford can see from the bottom of the porch that one of its back tires is flat, or close to it. How Stanley managed to get it here on slick mountain roads in the dead of winter, Ford has no idea. Ford for once follows in Stanley's footsteps and gets closer to the car. As he goes, he notices one of the headlights is broken, smashed in and taped over. Suddenly, Stanford doesn't want to get any closer. Sometimes, when Ford was weak and lonely, stuck on some terrible college assignment, or terribly drunk, he would make up lives for Stanley to be living. Ford was never imaginative, all of his dreams based on cold, hard facts. The Jersey Devil, aliens, unicorns, everything Ford would dream of doing or seeing was truth. Stanley was always the one with stories coming up, with plots or adventures they'd have someday. Ford's dreams for Stanley were always soft and homesick. He'd dream of Stan's amazing life, one so great he never felt the need to write letters or call his freak of a twin brother. He went off and made millions, sailed away on a boat and got married and lived in a great big house on the sea nowhere near Glass Shard Beach, with a yard and a garden and a couple of dimpled, smiling children and a dog, and standing in the snow, his hand resting on the handle of the driver's side door to Stanley's old beat-up car, Ford's softer dreams of a beautiful life for Stanley come crashing down. For a moment, just a moment, Ford believes wholeheartedly that when he opens the car door, Stan will come barreling out of the house, down the steps, and tackle him for touching his precious car. Ford believes it. He hopes for it desperately as he pulls on the handle. The car door swings out with a small metallic screech, and the door to the cabin remains closed. To put it lightly, the car is a mess. Stanford furrows his brows at the smell. The driver's seat is cleared off, but the bench seat's passenger side is covered with clutter. Trash, old plastic water bottles, and food containers litter the front seat. On the floor there is an old duffel bag with a broken zipper, stuffed with clothes, shoes, and toiletries, and when Ford kneels on the bench seat to take a look into the back, a spring in the driver's seat cushion pokes up and stabs into his knee. The back seat is worse. The first thing Stanford notices is the blankets, a blur of different fabrics and colors, all bunched together like a rat's nest, thrown and shoved up against the back door. There is an old pillow on the other side, its casing yellowed with age and use. A sleeping bag is stuffed where someone's feet would go, rolled up messily and secured with a belt. The most pristine thing in the car is a first aid kit, half-stocked, sitting undisturbed in the exact center of the back seat, easily seen and easily accessible if someone needed to grab it from the front. Stanford turns back around and stutters in a breath. He can smell old food wrappers, desperation and musty cloth, and every single question he'd had about Stan's life in those 10 years was answered in one sickeningly swift punch to the gut. Ford swings the car door closed and lets him feel suffocated inside. Stanley has been living in his car. For exactly how long, Ford doesn't know. But given that the duffel bag sitting a foot away from him was the same one Stanley was tossed when he was kicked out, the same one he threw into the back seat as he stood outside on that damned sidewalk in front of the damned pawn shop, Ford feels confident in his guess that Stan had been living in his car roughly the entire time. The entire time Stanford was complaining of mostly bug-free dorms. The entire time Stanford was rolling his eyes at new apartment listings in California or sketching out the layout for his new house, Stanley was living, no, surviving out of the back seat of his car. Ford fixes his gaze on the steering wheel, clenching and unclenching his hands in his lap. The whole time. Stanford sniffs, then feels his breath start to speed up, and his eyes prick with tears. He straightens in the uncomfortable seat. No, he will not cry in Stan's car. His eyes drift down to the center console. There, propped up against the stick shift, is a postcard. His postcard. Stanford picks it up reverently. He knows exactly what is printed in big, blocky letters on the other side. He'd debated with himself for hours about what to write. Back inside the cabin, in his study, there were dozens of crumpled up, discarded start-still letters, calls for help scratched out and restarted after the first sentence. "I'm sorry," felt disingenuous. "I need your help," sounded too pleading, and "I made a mistake and the only person I trust is you," was far too vulnerable. It was only after pages of failed starts and too many nights without sleep that Ford finally decided on two words. Two words that kept his secrets for him, but sounded apathetic and unforgiving now that he was reading them again. "Please come." Was that really all he'd written? Two words that sent Stanley across the country to his doorstep. Two words from someone Stan hadn't heard from in 10 years. From a brother who'd turned his back the last time they'd spoken. Two words from a brother who'd killed him when he did arrive. Tears gather and pool over Stanford's eyes. Stanley came the moment he called. Ford's hands tremble around the postcard. He stares at it again, the washed-out grays and blues of the background and the orange of the lettering. He'd bought the postcard the last time he'd gone into town for supplies, paranoid and frightened. He'd grabbed it on the way out on sheer impulse. Stanford slides the card into his jacket, grabs the half-zipped duffel bag from the passenger seat, and steps back out into the snow. He trudges back into the cabin, mind thankfully, blissfully silent. Ford locks the door behind him and simply breathes against it for a moment. He knows he will have to go out again soon. He needs his third journal. His notes on the undead are a reference he needs desperately in order to complete his plans. He'll need to hike to its hidden location, a difficult task in the snow. It'll take hours. He'll be completely vulnerable, and worse, he needs to bring a weapon. Stanford leaves the discarded crossbow on the porch to freeze. On the way back to the basement, Stanford stops in the laundry room. He dumps the clothes in the duffel bag into the wash, leaving the shoes and the toiletries on top. He'd grabbed the jacket from downstairs and washed that too. When Stanley woke up, he'd have fresh clothing to change into. Stanford could keep the dryer running. Until then, just to make sure. He stops again at the top stairs of the basement. He'd gotten the answers to his questions. Stanford knows sincerely that his brother lies dead down there, but he also knows most absolutely, in the same way he knows that he has 6 fingers on each hand, and that Stan will always come back when he calls. Ford knows that he will bring Stanley back. This, at the very least, is not something he will fail at. Ford walks back down the basement stairs, wincing at the sound of crunching snow under his boots. He leans on the doorframe to the portal control room for a moment, and brushes most of the remaining cold from the soles of his feet with his scarred knuckles. The fluorescent lights down here make the trampled drops of snow shine, and Ford wipes the wetness off his hand with his coat. He looks up and freezes completely. The body on the table is sitting up. The plaid blanket is pulled around its waist, fingers slowly curling and uncurling in its lap. The head snaps toward Ford, quickly, like a puppet jumping into place before a show. The shoulders turn with it, and stop just as suddenly. Stanford stops breathing. The body's eyes glow yellow.